Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? And I'd like to begin by saying welcome to this event this afternoon, which is the third in a series of programs that are sponsored by the Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail and the African American Cultural Center. Today's program is on Black Indians, and hopefully we'll all learn a little bit more about Black history and the Native American history and something about what happened when these two cultures sort of intermingled. I must say that our planned speaker and facilitator for this afternoon was Everett Tolo Wheaton, but he couldn't make it because of the weather. He would be driving up from Rhode Island, so he had to cancel. But not to worry, we have an excellent stand-in, and that's in the person of David Waters, the Honorable David Waters, who is a New Hampshire State Representative and English professor at University of New Hampshire. In addition, he's the director of the Center for New England Culture. So I'm sure we won't be disappointed in what David has to say. And I'm not going to take a lot of time by chatting at you with you, but I would like for Jerry Ann to come up, who has a few words to say before we get started for the afternoon's program.
Thanks, Kel, and thank you all for coming out on this day after a big snowstorm. We're always happy to see our rooms fill up. The conversation today will take us one step further than if you were here last week. We talked a little bit about colorism. So this program today will take us in another step in that dialogue. And it will be a dialogue. David Waters is a great facilitator, so we'll be able to talk a lot about this. I also want to remind you, for next week, we'll be having a panel discussion from professors from UNH on 12 Years a Slave. And if you haven't seen the film yet, it is at the Music Hall on, what date? Tuesday, February 18th at 7 p.m. So if you want to be part of that dialogue, which will be another real interesting dialogue on Black history, please try to see the film. So for now, we'll just go right into the movie and into our dialogue. Thank you all for coming.
Just Tall Oak wanted to make a comment. He is sorry that he couldn't be here because he just got plowed out. They got really blasted in Rhode Island. So he'll say something over to all over the speaker before our David Waters speak, if that's all right.
Oh, you want to try and get him on
speaker?
Yeah, I'll give it a try.
Hello?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. We're just going to mic you a bit. This is technology at its finest.
Which one is this?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, let's do this. Can you hear me now?
Yes. I can hear.
Okay, wait a second. You can go ahead and say what you had to say. They're listening now.
Okay. The first thing I need to say is that the film itself, I was curious why it was selected, and I understand the marketing strategy is what usually gets people to buy anything in this land of opportunity. But the land of opportunity concept has been accepted because this has become the land of opportunists, and that's all marketing and good marketing strategy amounts to. And we all, as consumers, become the victims of that. So if that film was marketed as an award-winning film, it's only because of the marketing, not necessarily because it's the best film on the topic. And I have to take exception with that because I think the film was not of the best quality. I would not buy it myself. I was willing to come up and speak about it, but it's not a film. It was filmed primarily at the Mashantucket Pequot powwow, which was the largest powwow in the country at that time. And I felt that it was just exploitation of the subject of the mixing of Indian and African blood in this country. So they didn't do the research they should have done. It was shallow at best, whatever research they did claim to do. And they just took advantage of the fact that they had people there of mixed blood, and they turned the camera on and the microphones. But my main objection to the title is that the title itself does injustice to our people who have that mixture. I don't deny the mixture. I understand all the bloods that I have in my background because I've been over 30 years doing genealogy of my own family. And in that process, I've seen the genealogy of many other families that I know and that are connected with me directly or indirectly. But what I take exception to is what most of us of that mixture have done. It's because it perpetuates the concept that we are not Indian, we have no right to be Indian, that we should really be labeled as black. And that has been the popular conception for too many years. Even the U.S. government has accepted that, and they developed what we call the one-drop rule. If you have one drop of black blood, that cancels out all the other, unless the other blood is white. And so people with the white mixture, Native people, they were accepted by the BIA, and people that had any black blood in their background were not accepted. It did become the official U.S. government policy, and so much of the vital records that I and many others have explored doing genealogy all document that fact. The people who I have photographs of who showed no black blood that were identified as black nevertheless, because the people who were writing down the information or misinformation put down what they chose. And so we've been the victims for too many years, and to have that title for that film try to talk about the topic, to me, continues the injustice of the past. And it's unfortunate that people that I know even that participated didn't realize how they were being used in that respect to continue that process. And that's the main point that I try to make whenever I talk about the topic. And the fact that blue-eyed Cherokees and blonde-headed Mohawks can be identified as Indian and not have to have the label as Euro-Americans. I don't think that people that have any black blood and mixed with the Indians should be identified as Afro-Indians. And so I reject that label completely on that ground, because what's good for the goose has to be good for the gander. And I just want you all to take a look at that and look at the unfairness that's in that process, so that you can see where I'm coming from and others who feel like me. I have a friend who was the highest ranking Indian in the U.S. Department of Labor in the Northeast for many years before he retired. And when I told him about the film, his feelings were even stronger than mine because of how he's been victimized by that process. So it's a very sensitive subject with Native people who have any black blood in their background, and that's what's behind it. If anyone mislabeled you, you would reject that yourself. Anyone there that has a sense of fairness. And racial identities should be a subject that the individual has a right to determine, not have someone on the outside attach a label that suits their convenience, because that's all it has amounted to. And the ultimate objective was to erase us from the landscape and to stop our right to be who the Creator made us. Our survival is based on asserting our identity and having a right to the identity ancestors and the Creator has given us. And no one has a right to take away
Tall Oak, there's a question on what film you would recommend.
Well, not simply because I was in it. There was a film of Native Americans, black and white.
Native American, black and white.
Before we were introduced by phone by a mutual friend out in Seattle, Washington. And I agreed to participate only because I expressed what I just did to you. And she said, well, you could say that in the film. So that's what I did. So that was well done, and we developed a relationship of mutual respect to the degree that she even paid for money from her grant to have me come out there when the film was previewed. So we still exchange Christmas cards and talk from time to time, because I had to establish the ground rules on which I would deal with that subject. And so
What do folks think? Yeah.
I can't respect for all the people involved, then it is a much better product. And filmmakers need to understand that, because so many people have their scripts all written, or journalists have their stories all written. They come to the individual and they just want them to rubber stamp what they already have. I don't work that way. And so that is the one film I know of on that topic. There may be others, but that's the one I'm most familiar with that I would recommend. And she's gotten several awards for that. And a conference that I attended out in University of Kansas in Haskell, jointly sponsored it in '07, I believe it was. She came and she showed her film there. It was well received because it dealt with the topic of the conference, which Americans, the first and the forced. It was based on the first Americans and the forced Americans, namely the African Americans who were brought here by force. And so that was
Well, those were actually very interesting comments from Tall concerning the Pequot situation, and I'll just say a kind of a little couple words of context for what he was saying, and then I'd like just to open up for conversation about the film. When the Pequot Nation was pursuing its tribal recognition during the 1970s and 80s and its petitions to become recognized, federally recognized as a tribe, you have to prove a genealogical tradition, and that's when we get into the issues of blood quantum and so on, but you have to show a continuous genealogical tracing that goes back to folks who were enrolled in the census of 1870. The second aspect you have to demonstrate is there was a continuous tribal structure in place during that period. Now, the Pequots, because there had been one family that stuck it out on the remaining land there, and there had been gatherings, were going to be able to do pretty well on that side of it. So the struggle in Connecticut became over the genealogical aspect of it. And so at that time, you begin, if you read the newspapers and the government responses to the petition in the 1970s and 80s, you will see this claim begin to emerge. They're not really Indians, they're Negroes. And this continued even after recognition. Then in 1993, which is the date you saw referenced by one of the speakers on the film, those folks who had been enrolled as Pequots decided to open up the tribal enrollment lists, because under federal law, the tribe gets to decide who is a tribal member, to a number of people who had Pequot ancestry, but who had, for maybe a couple generations even, been living with the Narragansetts or in Rhode Island, and therefore we heard some say had been identified as African Americans. And so that greatly expanded the tribal roles, and it was around the time of the casino being built, and many of those folks who were newly enrolled became parts of the leadership. And if you read the Hartford Courant, particularly in a 2001 article published in the Hartford Courant, which is very damaging, very painful, which not only said these aren't Indians, they're just those, Narragansett black people, and also associated them with criminality. Now, where have we heard that before? Once you have black people, you have criminality. and used this as a way of attacking the whole structure that was developing around the casino. And there have been divisions in the elections between folks who enrolled before '93 and after '93 among the Pequots, and sometimes within the tribe. Then it has played out over race. Now, there's a long history within Narragansett Nation over the issue of African Americans. If you read William Simmons' book, The Spirit of the New England Tribes, which collects folklore from Native American communities in southern New England, there is a Narragansett folktale that, from the late 19th, early 20th century, describing that time back in the 18th century when Narragansetts intermarried with African Americans, and famous incident when some Native women purchased husbands out of slavery. And the folktale tells the story of why Narragansett people's hair became curly. So these are traditions within the tribe, but it gets back into some of the kind of intertribal issues in that area. So I just want to give a little context of why that has been such a issue, and as Tall Oak said, it's because of what these outsiders, the state of Connecticut, and the white racist structure, which has tried to define race in terms of black and white and the one-drop rule, how painful and destructive that had been to the Pequot groups and others. So what did you think of the film? I mean, we had Tall Oak, and how'd you like the film? What do folks think?
I wanted to know how they define, what's the difference between race and ethnicity? Because they talked about that in the film, and
Well, as the film pointed out, the concepts of race perhaps developing during the 15th and 16th centuries in Europe developed these categorizations of racial groupings, and the implication by the 19th century, when so-called scientific racism was attempting to define very hard boundaries between the races. And we see the implication of that in slavery and the one-drop rule, and in blood quantum issues for tribal enrollment and so on. And so a lot of individuals who critique and have a good justification in science and other historical reasons to critique the notions of race as being anything stable or definable in those ways, have used that concept of ethnicity, where people define their cultural groupings by a series of practices, religions, a language, and identifications that could be defined that way. So they're kind of oppositional terms as they were being used in the film. And also in terms of this too, it says that if the concept of Indianness includes that concept of ethnicity, then it erases these kind of artificial barriers of black and Indian as well, because the tribes can get to decide, an individual say, who am I? And without having these kind of artificial exterior distinctions based on racial oppressions brought into those individual or tribal identities. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Well, I enjoyed it very much, but I thought the quality of the film itself, the physical quality was poor, the lighting was poor, I couldn't see these folks. And so that was disappointing. Yeah. But as far as, bringing me new information and understanding of my own New England area and these issues that are not front and center for me all the time, it was very good.
It does seem to bring out some kind of nuances or different perspectives on issues of colorism and issues of racial identification that get outside of that black-white binary. And I wondered if people had kind of thoughts or feelings about what we learned about this notion of black Indian and the kind of issues that raised in the film.
Look, I thought it was fascinating. I mean, I remember when I was in high school, first finding I read a book and it talked about how Native Americans ran into African Americans, and I'd never thought about it. In my own family history, we have Cherokee in our background. So it's something that I haven't had. I mean, I still look to this topic. I mean, it's interesting, and I haven't really had time to really get into it as much as I would, and I'd like to find out even more about my own family. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and wasn't it interesting about some of the discussion, and several folks said that you know, why would people choose to be one as opposed to another, depending on when it was in American history? You know, well, if they think all the Indians out to oh, I'm black, you know, oh, it's slavery, I'm Indian, you know, it's really interesting that.
And where it is geographically, because I'm from the Southwest.
Yeah.
And basically, if you just switch out Spanish, Anglo, and Native, it's a lot of the same issues, just different players. For me, the film was very interesting. My niece is, her mom is Anglo and Cherokee, and her dad is African American, and yet the struggles that she's been dealing with has been more between inclusion in either Anglo or African American culture. And she had enough of a struggle that she decided to go back to Tennessee because she didn't feel comfortable in Colorado. And so it was very interesting because, like, when I think of my niece, you know, even though there's Native American heritage there, it's Cherokee from Georgia. There's no identification, even though my sister and I grew up in New Mexico. There should be some identification, something, because we grew up when AIM was big and there was a lot of empowerment and a lot of awareness in New Mexico, and it was such a rich time to be there. It was interesting. It opened up a lot of thoughts and questions that I hadn't really had in relation to my family and you know, what the current struggles are.
Well, there you are. You know, how can you be who you are in an either-or society, in a society which has these very powerful, you know, forces of oppression and racial discrimination that are, you know, that mean that your sense of personal identity is going to be politicized, and there are going to be implications about that.
And now, out west, a lot of times it's the prejudice is not against the African American blood inclusion because there was less. There is the prejudice against any Native American blood. And then, you know, I always wonder with, you're starting to have issues now out west with the tribes disenrolling people because of the financial incentives. And it's crazy.
The disenrollment, this film was filmed before what happened last year when the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma decided to disenroll descendants of the freedmen.
Well, it's happening in Oregon and Washington too.
Yeah, and this is a very difficult story. But other thoughts on what we saw in the film about these conflicts about identification and the reasons people might identify one way or another? And
my mother named Siobhan something, and I had no problem growing up. I grew up, my grandmother was in the house, and we had no problems whatsoever. Of course, we had our own land, so I guess we didn't have to worry about that. So just have to share that with you. I'm okay.
Oh, I know you're okay. Well, Freddie, how was it in your household that the Native aspect of your family was talked about or evidenced or claimed? Or,
it was mostly the food.
Yeah.
What my mother didn't like was moccasins.
Yeah.
Because she had to go to school with wet or something, so she didn't like that. That was the only thing that I could remember that she didn't like to talk about, and you couldn't wear them in the house. Was the moccasins.
Interesting. You know, one little story, we had a lot about the enrollment, but also the census records there, and who gets called what. I've done some research on a man called Samson Battis, who may have had mixed African and Native heritage, but he was born about 1750 in Rollinsford as a slave, and he first comes to historical record in the 1770s in Canterbury when he begins to serve in the American Revolution, is granted his freedom after the war, gets some land. He purchases out of slavery from the minister of Concord a woman who was a West Indian. Maybe she had had native New England heritage and been sold into slavery, as many native New Englanders were in the 1600s and 1700s. Now, they had 12 children, and one of his daughters had 18 children, but there were never more than 5 African Americans ever listed in the census in Canterbury, New Hampshire. And you can find their burying ground and all that. But during the early part of the early censuses, they were identified as black. And then in the 1840s and 50s, they became mulattoes, even though there was both native and African and white mixture in the family by then. And then by the 1860s and 70s, they began to be called white, although because they were native to the community, and the implication of being what it meant to be black or mulatto by that time. But after writing white after some of these individuals, the town clerk wrote very dark with the word very underlined. So you can see this kind of interplay as to identity in the eyes of the federal government. And so what it does mean, though, is that we lose that mixed history. At some point in the 1830s, 1840s in New Hampshire, anybody who was dark complected became black, whether they were Indian or black. And the term mulatto goes out of the United States Census after, is it 1850 or 1860 is the last time it's used, Jeff? Do you remember? Anyway, I think maybe it's 1860, but that goes away, and so the kind of narrowing of those categories comes in. Valerie? Yeah.
Well, when you mentioned the census, that I have wondered too about the accuracy of the total numbers that are reported, because I think at some times they didn't have to count anybody under the age of 16. And we know that there were a lot of large families, and by the time the kid was 16, they could have moved on to someplace else. So that, so if it says that a town had 5 people, they mean people over the age of 16, but that doesn't necessarily reflect who actually was there.
Those forms had children under, I mean, there were different age groupings, and they had one under, they had children under 16. Yeah. I thought maybe since the film started with that figure of Crispus Attucks, and some people know who he is, first to fall in the American Revolution, so-called, in the Boston Massacre of 1770s, and he's one of the few figures of mixed African and Native American heritage to have kind of gained some visibility in New England history. His father probably, I mean, there is some uncertainty about the ancestry, but his father was probably Prince Younger, who had been enslaved as an enslaved African, and perhaps his mother was Nancy Attucks, who was a Natick Indian, and perhaps her father was a John Attucks, who is known in historical record because he was hanged in Natick. So, when he joins that kind of mixed community of sailors, indentured servants, slaves in Boston, and has escaped from his master as an indentured person, and is there in the fray in front of the old State House in 1770, and one of 3 people who died instantly after being shot by the British troops. He kind of was retrieved as a historical figure by African Americans who raised money to have his statue placed on Boston Common and celebrated Boston Massacre Day in the name of Crispus Attucks during the 19th century. But that Native community, I mean, there it is, and the research has shown that that was a mixed community. In the colonial records, sometimes they use the term musty for someone who was black and Indian, and you see that term in Rhode Island documents and censuses pretty commonly because there's a large mixed community in Providence, which has been pretty well documented. Eleanor Eldridge's autobiography talks about it, and we saw the author of Disowning Slavery, and what was her name again? Yeah, she has a good chapter on that community as well. But that Native community is particularly interesting. It was founded by John Eliot as a so-called praying Indian community in the 1650s, and then famously evacuated during King Philip's War. And the people who were being evacuated were attacked on their way to Boston, and then put out in the island in Boston Harbor, where many of them starved and froze to death. And most people think, well, that was the end of the community, but a lot of the survivors went back to Natick, and through the end of the 1700s, there are references to that Natick community being mixed race, and people with these multiple identifications. So it's interesting. We do have Crispus Attucks. Jeff, yeah.
Just to go back to the film, David, I thought this whole thing, listening to the film and then listening to Tall Oak, I was just like, oh, I told Jerry Ann before I could say something in politics, and now I know I can. I mean, this whole thing is so muddled because it really depends where you come from. I mean, the film is all about trying to recover and recapture and celebrate an aspect of the American heritage that's been sort of lost, the fusion of Afro and Indian people for centuries. And it's been going on in many ways in many places for a long time, and now the filmmakers say, let's celebrate this. So that's one agenda. Tall Oak has another agenda, which, as David contextualized very nicely, is to suggest that there is more racially charged now purity to the Pequot people, and they haven't been sort of mixed with black blood, which, to me, this whole notion about quantum and everything is like, how many people in the room know with whom your great-grandmother was sleeping,
Yeah.
So right now, the way that this is shaking out in our society is we still have this legacy of white supremacy, which would like to denigrate people of color, whether Cape Verdean or African or Afro-American, Native American, hybrids, whatever. But then we also have a lot of people of those communities that have been sometimes called minority communities or communities of color who very much celebrate their heritage, and for Tall Oak to say, for instance, that it doesn't matter, you should just identify as you wish, is just such nonsense, if I can say it, because actually the law says it really matters quite a bit, and there's all sorts of American laws right now that speak to, again, Native American ancestry, who's in a tribe, affirmative action, this and that. And so for us to suggest it doesn't matter, no, it actually matters a lot to people. So there's a lot of different agendas going on here, and I found that I was just hearing like from one side or the other side, but there wasn't much speaking to how complicated it really is. And I think the lady's question here about, could you just define race and ethnicity?
Yeah, I mean, really. Yeah, really.
Well, even, that's like, even if Obama came out and said, identified himself as white, yeah, good luck with that, right?
and so an example I use with my students sometimes is like Tiger Woods' kids. I mean, here's this guy who's Afro-Asian in certain ways. He's married this Swedish woman, and put aside their marital problems, they have these children. And so how are the children going to identify? And in certain ways, the children, depending on where they live, in a situational kind of ethnicity, you can move one way or another. The boundaries are sort of flexible, but for somebody to suggest that these children are meant to pick one of this pretty complicated situation, not easy.
Well, the Obama example, he writes in his autobiography, Dreams of My Father, that when he was living in Indonesia and in Hawaii, it wasn't as much of an issue, but when he went to Occidental in California, he realized, I've got to choose a race. I have to do it. And of course, there are consequences if you do, and there are consequences if you don't.
Or just to play on that, Paul Cuffey, as a young man, said, my nature is musta. In other words, he had an Ashanti father and a Wampanoag Indian mother. Okay, so he said, my nature is musta, or as Dave said, musti, which is this African Indian, African Native American cross. As Cuffey gets older and becomes more politicized, he says, I'm of the African race. He adopts a diasporic identity, and he privileges his father's African identity over his mother's, even though he'd been raised really as a Wampanoag. His son, namesake son, Paul Cuffey Jr., then writes a memoir that says, narrative of Paul Cuffey, a Pequot Indian. It's like, take that, Dad. I ain't no black guy. So here you have this one very politically prominent family at the time that can choose or go back and forth,
David, I also think that the whole thing about blood and culture, the question that they raise, culture complicates it. Because, especially like in New England, if you have kids of mixed race here and they're raised more in a white environment, does that make them white? It doesn't make them black in the black culture.
But
It
even
doesn't
that,
make them
but
white.
even that, I mean, I remember years ago.
It's an issue of culture as well.
Years ago when
what
I
you're
went
surrounded with.
to Philadelphia, I go to Philadelphia, people are like, you sound white.
Exactly.
Excuse me, I'm from Philadelphia, and they said that to me.
Back there and into, yeah.
As a person who's very proud of her native background, I brought a picture in of my great grandmother, and I was going to share it with Tall Tree. But since we're on the subject of being proud of who we are, I would like to share this with some of you to see my great grandmother, Elizabeth Marion Brown.
Would you mind just standing up so people can hear a little better? Maybe would you tell us a little bit about your family? And yeah.
They're from Georgia, and they moved to Alabama. So I've always heard about the Native Americans in my family, and we seem to be proud of it. Now, Dr. Gates, he thinks that we shouldn't do that, and that most of us who claim Native American background, that we're not proud of the African background. So therefore, we talk about and boast about the Native background. But I have African American and Native American and some other friends in my veins that can't separate any of them.
Thank you.
And for the young lady there, Sean, Georgia Cherokee, that she claimed to be Cherokee. As far as we know, that's what she is.
I think the world turned quite a bit for me in general semantics when they finally came up with the phrase, a difference has got to make a difference to be a difference. And so much of the labeling, well, to the individual, it's important. I think there was a good point made in the film. It's nobody's business, publicly. I mean, in other words, politically, that it's a personal thing as to what you choose to emphasize.
Well, that's certainly, the point here was that it's a personal difference, that you should be able to choose what that is, and that it's nobody else's business. And, you know, we do live in America, and people make choices for us about our differences, and they can enforce them. And I think that's you know, the overarching reality is, as Jeff mentioned, that we still live in a white supremacist society, and the implications that flow out from that over individuals' ability to be able to identify as they wish. Other questions or comments about the film? Yeah.
I feel like as much as it shouldn't be anyone's business how people, individuals choose to identify, as a student taking the SATs, that was always the hardest question. What are you? That question. Everything, the rest of it was fine.
Scared.
But my mother was born in Jamaica and my father was born on a farm in Maine, and I mean, the black circle, the white circle, the Pacific Islander circle, there's no blank. What do I write? Like that was always, because you had to choose. I mean, you couldn't skip that question, sadly.
You know, and that question of choice too, we had Thomas Doughton here, who was, who had several moments in the film, and I think there's no more tragic story in New England than that of the Nipmucks' attempts to establish tribal recognition and the forces that were brought to bear against them, depending on which administration in Washington was in power, and essentially erasing the Nipmucks with the rejection of their last application, or erasing them as a people.
Was that Rhode Island? I'm sorry. I'm not familiar.
Nipmucks are kind of in that area that's central Massachusetts, northern Rhode Island, northeastern Connecticut, in that region up through Worcester.
Could you just expand a little bit on the forces against that? What is it about the government that...
Well, part of it is going back to the 1870 census, because, you know, with any census, who got marked down at that census as being native, or who didn't, or they marked mulatto, or they marked black. Also, you know, native people kind of travel a lot, and so what if your family's on the road,
But I'm just
at
saying,
that
why
point in
was the
time.
government so?
Because the
organized?
government has chosen that census that you have to be able to have a native ancestry identified in that census and then be able to trace yourself back to an individual name in that census. And then the other issue about the continuous tribal structure as well. And the Nipmucs, the BIA gave them recognition, and then there was a political change in Washington, and it was taken away. And we saw this happen with the Wampanoags too. Now they're back, right? Yeah, Valerie? Yeah. Or, I'm sorry, you had a hand up earlier, so just a second, Valerie. Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm surprised at the irony that the government would say that the census would define, when the census takers were not professionals. They often spelled names wrong. They didn't really put attention to what that job was all about, and that changed history for some people. And yet that our government should say, we base everything on what they say. Makes it very difficult to trace back for a lot of us.
And Valerie?
I'm really not sure how to say this because I'm going to try to combine some comments here. But what I'm thinking about, what I have the perception I've always had is that the majority of black families have some Native American ancestry. This is sort of the way I learned it and heard it until very recently, and still I do. And then along comes Professor Gates, and he says most of this is fiction. But then I also know what we have been talking about today, about how at different periods of time it's been advantageous for different groups to identify in different ways. So if several generations ago it was advantageous for my father's family to identify as Native American instead of admitting in quotes, that Grandma Chris was the child of the slave owner, then it would come down through the family that we are Cherokee, not Scottish.
Well, there's another kind of New England twist on this too, which has, during the late 19th century and up through the 1950s with the eugenics movement, people were being forcibly sterilized if they were identified as being feeble-minded. And at that point in time, if you were identified as Abnaki, you were going to be identified as being feeble-minded in some parts of northern Vermont. And so a lot of people either went underground or kind of hid out or didn't respond to censuses or identified as being, a French Canadian at that point in time. And if you look at the records in the Concord State Hospital about who was being sterilized, you can see it was Native Americans, it was also African Americans, it was people of mixed race, and just that mixture was almost a proof of being feeble-minded at that time. So sterilization. So you can see there be, many, many different reasons at certain points of times why one heritage one would not want to claim it. Well, great discussion, and maybe we still some refreshments, and thanks to Jerry Ann and to the Center for this great event.
Yes, we still have some refreshments in the back. Please enjoy yourself, and we look forward to seeing you next Sunday for 12 hours at the Senior.